I am who I am because it's been like Yun Chun grandfather, one in a billion ancestor. I need to define my space, define my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mind Your Margins, a podcast that seeks to foster a space where it's humanly possible to make humanity possible. My name is Michelle Myers, and I'll be trying my best to help us navigate through topics about marginalized identities and prioritizing the perspectives of people who may feel invisible or silenced or ignored or erased. Also, I want to acknowledge that these discussions are difficult, but I'm hoping that through these conversations, we can claim space for understanding and compassion. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to this episode today. I hope 2026 has started off well for you. But before I get into today's topic, as I do at the beginning of every episode, I'm going to share a land acknowledgement statement. I call out to the ancestors of the native peoples of this land in the hopes that by honoring them, I also honor my mother and my father, who are now ancestors, and through them connect to my Korean ancestors and the land of my birth. I hope that you will reflect on the words as I speak them. I acknowledge that the land on which I live and work are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware continue to this day. I recognize that the place where I recorded this podcast also sits on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. I and my listeners take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has brought ourselves here. We are grateful to be guests in these lands and commit in solidarity in the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. This land acknowledgement does not correct the wrongs committed against the Lenape or any of the other First Nation peoples across this continent, but through it, I hope to remind myself and my listeners of our connections and indebtedness to the Indigenous people of this land, and particularly of New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Saying their names and learning their histories call them into our consciousness and awareness. Thank you very much for listening to that land acknowledgement statement. I want to take a moment to name why land acknowledgements matter, especially right now. We're living in a time when ICE agents are raiding people's homes and communities, rounding up entire families, and putting them into detention centers and prisons. These actions are often driven by racial profiling, and the harm doesn't stop with undocumented immigrants. Native Americans have been targeted as well. And I want to share something that happened in my classroom a couple of weeks ago. I have a student this semester who identifies as biracial, as Native American and African American. And she broke down in tears during class at the beginning of the semester. She told us how she was accosted by ICE agents and detained for several hours. She described how they repeatedly ridiculed her and didn't believe her when she said she was Native American. Her identity, her truth, her humanity were all questioned. When she shared this story with us, she was still deeply shaken, and as a class, we paused, held space for her, and listened as she shared the pain of that experience. The same student told me she appreciated that I started this semester with a land acknowledgement statement, even though it's a public speaking class and not a history class or something like that, because she said it made her feel seen and valued. It made me feel grateful that sharing a land acknowledgement statement didn't feel like empty words to her. And stories like hers about being accosted by ICE agents as someone who identifies as Native American are not isolated incidents. As ICE carries out increasingly aggressive, violent, and brutal raids, U.S. citizens have also been harmed and even killed, as we've sadly and tragically witnessed in Minneapolis. This is part of the larger context we need to understand when we talk about immigration enforcement and racial profiling. And to further ground this reality, we'll include a link in the episode description to a CNN interview with actress Elaine Miles, who was also accosted by ICE agents and told that her tribal ID was fake. These experiences underscore how Native people once again are being treated as if they don't belong on their own land. All of this brings me to today's episode, where I'll begin to reflect on what I've learned from being one half of Yellow Rage, since this year marks the 25th anniversary of Yellow Rage. Now, some people might think Katsy and I are quote-unquote retired, but we haven't officially announced that yet, so I guess it's more accurate to say that we're semi-retired. But when it comes to this 25th anniversary, there are a couple of ways to count it. So if we go by when Katsy and I first met and began writing together, that was in 2000. So 2025 would have been our 25th year. But if we go by when we appeared on HBO's Def Poetry Jam, which is when most people first encountered our work, then this year marks 25 years. So I'm claiming 2026 as our 25th year. And I want to take time to reflect on what I've learned after over a quarter century of being part of Yellow Rage. Oh my gosh, I feel really old saying that, just saying a quarter century. But I'm thinking of these episodes I'm recording this year as oral histories or verbal memoirs, where I share my experiences, my memories, my thoughts and feelings as one of the founding members of Yellow Rage. And as I'm recording this episode, I just turned 54 years old about a week ago, and I'm feeling a sense of urgency at this point in my life to document things that are important to me. And of course, Yellow Rage has been one of the most significant accomplishments in my life. So this anniversary year, I want to look back while also looking forward. And the first thing I want to talk about is anger. Because I have been angry for most of my life, deeply angry and heartbroken about many things. Recently, as I know is true for many people, I've been watching the news and scrolling through social media, witnessing the detainment and deportation of immigrants, and learning about the murders of Alex Preddy and Renee Good in Minneapolis by ICE agents. It's a lot to hold. It's overwhelming. And it stirs up a familiar old anger in me. In the previous Mind Your Margins episode, which was episode 10, titled The Fire in the Feed, I talked about how social media disinformation fuels chaos and how important it is to slow down, listen, and be intentional about what we share. And for the past 5 years or so, I've been paying attention to my own anger, how it shows up in my body, how it shapes my reactions, and how it can influence what I say and post in the heat of the moment. So today's episode is deeply personal for me, and it's going to be part 1 in a series where I talk about my anger, where it comes from, what it has given me, what it's cost me, and how it's changed over time. And also how 25 years of being part of Yellow Rage has shaped my relationship to anger. So in this episode, I'm going to start at the beginning, at the founding of Yellow Rage. I mean, for me, just thinking about the eventuality of Katsy and I announcing that we are retiring Yellow Rage, I can't help but have memories of how we got started. And so I'm going to talk about that in this episode and how anger was already a point of tension back then. Also, I want to make it very clear that everything I share is based on my memories and perspectives. So I'm not speaking for Katsy in any way. She may have different memories and perspectives, which is the nature of human experience and reality. The same goes for Sapna Shah and anyone else that I may mention. So I just wanted to make that clear before I get started. And speaking of starting, I want to start at the beginning of how we got started as Yellow Rage, because a lot of people think they know the backstory of Yellow Rage, but most people actually don't. Like, very few people know that Yellow Rage didn't start as a duo. We started as a trio. In the summer of 2000, I met Katsy and another young woman named Sapna Shah at Asian Arts Initiative in Philadelphia during the Something to Say workshop. So the three of us became Yellow Rage. Me, a biracial Korean American woman, Katsy, who identifies as a Lao American woman, and Sapna Shah, who identified as an Indian American or South Asian American woman. And our actual full group name is Black Hair, Brown Eyes, Yellow Rage. Katsy and Sapna were actually the ones who came up with our name after many really dumb ones that we had all come up with, like silk and, I don't know, rice paper. I don't even remember what they were. I just know they were bad. And our group name, Black Hair, Brown Eyes, Yellow Rage, was supposed to represent what the three of us had in common as Asian American women, even though we came from different backgrounds and were different ethnicities. And I'm pretty sure the Yellow Rage part of our name was inspired by this Asian American rock band called Yellow Peril, which Katsy was familiar with because our friend Bert Wong was a part of that band. So that's the short version of the story behind our name. So by the time I met Sapna and Katsy, my anger was right at the surface. I mean, I wasn't even trying to hide it. I wasn't even capable of hiding it. And in another episode, I'll probably talk more about my younger years and how and why I was carrying so much anger at that point in my life. But I was in my late 20s, around 27 or 28. I wore my heart on my sleeve, and I was a very angry person. And I think it's important for me to be straight up about this as well. During that period, from my early 20s into maybe my mid 30s, I hated white people. I did. I'm using that word hated very intentionally. I carried a deep distrust of white people. And that distrust didn't come out of nowhere. It came from my own family, the white side of my family, from people I tried to be friends with, from white boyfriends I dated in high school and their families. And what I experienced over and over again was this split. Their public face versus their private one. In public, they were nice. They were quote unquote open. Back then, we used to call it being quote unquote tolerant. But behind closed doors, when they thought they were safe, when they thought they were among people they could trust, that's when the N-word came out. That's when the racist jokes came out. That's when I saw who they really were. So I remember thinking, if you can smile in public and say you're open-minded, but then turn around and say these other hateful, racist things in private, how am I supposed to trust you? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? And so I didn't. I stopped trusting white people altogether. So when I walked into that Something to Say workshop at Asian Arts Initiative in the summer of 2000, I was angry. Very, very angry. And that was the energy I wanted to express. That was the kind of poetry I wanted to write. Well, actually, let me back up a little. The Something to Say workshop at AAI was led by the amazing performance artist and facilitator, Gary San Angel, who became a trusted mentor to me. And at that time, Gail Issa was the executive director and founder of Asian Arts Initiative. And both she and Gary welcomed me with open arms. And AAI came to feel like a second home to me. When I first started the workshop, the first writing prompts Gary gave us, honestly, I wasn't writing about rage yet. I was writing sad poems about my mom. So the first spoken word poems I ever shared publicly with the other participants of the workshop were about my mom. But that's a whole other conversation, and maybe I'll come back to that another time. So not long after starting the workshop and writing these poems about my mom, anger became the dominant theme in my writing. Anger about being sexually objectified as an Asian American woman, anger about racism, anger about being judged for being biracial, especially about not being accepted, even within Asian American communities. That's the work I was writing during Something to Say. Then a few weeks into the workshop, Katsi shared a CD with me, Broken Speak by the Asian American spoken word group I Was Born with Two Tongues. And I can't emphasize enough how important that moment was for me. That was the first time I had ever heard Asian Americans express anger openly, unapologetically. They weren't asking permission. They weren't softening it. They were expressing rage, pride, and a demand for justice. They were naming injustices Asian Americans had experienced for decades, for centuries in this country. So listening to that CD was liberating. It cracked something open in me. It made me think, oh, I have a right to be angry, and I have a right to yell it out into the world. Because growing up, even though my mom herself carried a lot of anger, she always told me never to express it in public. If I was angry, I had to stuff it down, repress it. And if I showed anger outside the house, she worried about how it would reflect on her as a parent, that I would look out of control or embarrassing or shameful. I've shared this story many times about how when my mom first saw Katsi and me perform on HBO on Deaf Poetry Jam, she said to me, "Why did you have to go on TV and curse so much? Now I can't even tell our family in Korea you were on TV." So she was not happy about how openly angry I was in my poetry. But going back to my original point, when I heard Two Tongues poetry tracks on their CD Broken Speak, it felt like permission for me, permission to be angry, permission not to be ashamed of it, permission to see anger not just as something to vent, but as a tool, as a source of power. Because before that, most of my spoken word influences were Black poets like Saul Williams, Jessica Care Moore, Mums the Poet. I admired that they spoke openly about racism, and Jessica Care Moore, who identifies as biracial, sometimes spoke about the complexity regarding mixed race identity in her work. But there was also this unspoken narrative floating around in American society in general that Asian Americans didn't have the right to be angry, that justified anger belonged only to Black people. And there was a period in my life when even I was conditioned into believing that. But hearing Two Tongues changed that for me. It made me say, no, as an Asian American, my anger is justified. Our histories have been suppressed, erased, distorted, and that erasure is not accidental. It's systematic. So yes, I had a right to my anger. That was the space I was writing from, and it was real. It was authentic. And honestly, I'm still angry. I still consider myself an angry person. Even now, it's just been transformed or reframed, which I'll talk about more at some point. But when Katsi, Sepna, and I started writing and performing together, things weren't always easy. And this is something we've never really talked about publicly. But Sepna was uncomfortable with the anger Katsi and I expressed in poems like I'm a Woman Not a Flavor and Listen Asshole. Now, publicly, we've always said Sepna left Yellow Rage to focus on medical school. And that's true. But that's not the whole truth. The other truth is that she was uncomfortable with how confrontational our work was. And before I talk about this any further, I want to say that I'm not talking about this now because I'm trying to stir up controversy. I mean, this all happened 25 years ago. It doesn't make any difference now. I just want to have the space to reflect on my experiences, but I want to do that as honestly as I can. So again, I just want to make that clear. And I also want to be clear that in no way am I saying that Sepna was wrong or bad or anything negative. I have always thought that Sepna is a great person, a compassionate person, someone who genuinely wanted to bring people together. When she saw injustice, she wanted dialogue. She wanted conversation. She wanted to help people understand why something was harmful or offensive. I think she believed that many people genuinely didn't know better. So we should cut them some slack, show them some grace. And so she didn't really want to say fuck you in our poetry. That wasn't who she was. And I'll own up to even pressuring her to rewrite her lyrics to Listen Asshole because they had a let's talk this through kind of vibe. And the gist of pressuring her was basically, look, this poem is called Listen Asshole. These lyrics don't fit. But looking back now, I think pressuring Sepna to rewrite her lyrics to Listen Asshole may have been the beginning of the end of Yellow Rage as a trio. Because Sepna wanted connection and understanding through our poetry. And I did not. More specifically, I wasn't interested in appeasing white people. I wasn't trying to ease anyone's guilt or make anybody comfortable. Honestly, I wanted the opposite. I wanted their discomfort. I wanted them to feel the same discomfort I always felt. And I was fine with being confrontational because for most of my life up until that point, I had been the quiet little Asian girl who was too afraid to speak up, who didn't think I had a right to speak up. And I was done with that. So I wanted to say exactly what I felt. And at that point in my life, I wasn't willing to compromise anymore. And it's not that Sepna and I didn't get along. We did. I really liked her. She was in her mid-20s then, right between me and Katsi, who was only 19 when I first met her. So Sepna balanced us. She and I had long, thoughtful conversations, the kind where you actually feel heard. But this was the thing we kept circling back to, the place where we didn't quite see eye to eye. And part of it was because she had completely different experiences with white people. She really didn't see the racism from white people that I had. And she also thought the stereotypes that white people may believe about us were honest misunderstandings. But like I said earlier, I wasn't trying to hear that because I had witnessed with my very own eyes how two-faced white people could be. And these conversations really began to take shape when Def Poetry Jam invited us to perform in their first ever live show at the HBO US Comedy Arts Festival in Aspen, Colorado in February of 2001. By then, Yellow Rage had already come together in this very organic, almost accidental way during the Something to Say workshop. Like I had mentioned earlier, I was writing spoken word poetry while most of the other participants were doing more theater-based work. And then Katsi gave me the Broken Speak CD by Two Tongues, and there was this track written and performed by Anita and Emily called Not Your Fetish. I identified with it so much. It was about the sexual objectification of Asian and Asian American women, about being reduced to someone else's fantasy, And I had experienced that firsthand. Men from different racial backgrounds approaching me with assumptions they had already made about my body, my sexuality, who they thought I was supposed to be. So after listening to Not Your Fetish, that's when I wrote my lyrics and hook for I'm a Woman Not a Flavor. Then I invited the women in the workshop to contribute verses to the poem because I really wanted multiple female voices in the piece. And the only two women in the workshop who did write something were Katsi and Sepna. So that's how it became a group piece, and we performed it for the first time at Asian Arts Initiative in September of 2000. That Something to Say workshop was so impactful to everyone who participated that we kept meeting for months after the workshop had officially ended, because none of us were ready to let it go. It had impacted our lives so much, and we had bonded with each other. Then in October of 2000, I was reading the Philadelphia Inquirer, and yes, it was the actual print newspaper. That's how long ago this was. And I saw an article about Def Poetry Jam touring the country for a slam competition. And Philadelphia was going to be one of the first stops. So at one of our continuing Something to Say meetings, I remember saying to Katsi and Sepna, kind of offhand, oh, we should do it just for fun. Because none of us had ever slammed before. And both of them were like, yeah, let's do it. But when I look back at us then, I just have to laugh at how naive and inexperienced we were. So anyway, that's when we decided we needed a group name, that we couldn't just slam as Katsi, Sepna, and Michelle. And when we competed in the Def Poetry Slam in Philadelphia, which was probably sometime in November of 2000, we were the only Asian Americans there. Most of the other poets and most of the audience were Black. And we were so nervous. Sepna kept running to the bathroom because she felt sick. Katsi was visibly tense. I was pacing nonstop. I really thought it was going to be like Showtime at the Apollo and that we were going to get booed and yanked off stage. Then it was our turn and we got up on stage to perform I'm a Woman Not a Flavor. And the room just exploded. We got a full room standing ovation. People were stomping their feet, hooting and hollering and shouting. Afterward, folks crowded around us asking for our contact information. Oh my gosh, my hands were shaking so bad, I could barely write. To this day, that Philly Def Poetry Slam was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had on stage. And it's one of my favorite memories with Yellow Rage. But even though we made it to the finals, we didn't win the Philly Def Poetry Slam. But the producers of Def Poetry Jam liked us enough to invite us to New York City to audition for their live HBO show in Aspen. And a lot of people don't know this, but Russell Simmons was not involved in Def Poetry Jam in those early years. He didn't really have visibility around the show until it was greenlit for the HBO series. The executive producers of Def Poetry Jam in those early years, and who laid the foundations for it to become the HBO series, were Danny Simmons, Russell Simmons' brother, Bruce George, and Deb Pointer. And Deb was the person who we worked with the most and who advocated for us a lot behind the scenes. So when the producers asked us to come up to New York City in December of 2000 to audition for the Aspen show, we thought for sure that was the end of the road for us. Because we only had one piece, I'm a Woman Not a Flavor. But even with just I'm a Woman Not a Flavor at the audition, the HBO people loved us. So suddenly we were booked for Aspen, performing alongside poets who had inspired me. Jessica Care Moore, Black Ice, Taylor Mali, and Steve Coleman, all big names in the slam poetry scene back then. But then Def Poetry told us we needed 3 pieces to perform in the Aspen show. So really quickly, we had to add onto our set list. We couldn't just only perform I'm a Woman Not a Flavor. So of course, one of those other poems became Listen Asshole, which Katsi had originally written as a solo piece, but she offered it to the group. So we turned it into a group poem, and it was while we were writing that poem that Sepna became more vocal about feeling uncomfortable with the anger in our poetry. She told me the anger didn't feel like her, that it wasn't how she wanted people to see her. But I kept pushing her to focus on the message, the point of the piece, and that her friends and family should know who she is and would understand what we were trying to do. But underneath that, I was worried. I could feel how unhappy Sepna was becoming and that she might leave the group. But I also feel like Sepna didn't reject anger outright. What she struggled with was what came after, because she cared deeply about dialogue, about not being seen as someone who couldn't be talked to or as someone who was closed off or hostile. She didn't want people to hear our poems and think, oh, that's who she is. And honestly, I get that now, especially because around that time, we were already being dismissed for our anger. Like at local slams, people called us a gimmick. They'd say things like, you're such cute girls, and then you come up here cussing and swearing and yelling. Actually, after one of our deaf poetry performances in Aspen, these older white women came up to us afterwards and said, you seem like such nice girls. Why do you have to curse so much? And Sepna immediately tried to dialogue with them, and I just walked away because I was like, this is some model minority bullshit. So I kind of abandoned Sepna to deal with them. And then actually about a year later, Katsy and I wrote a group piece in response to these women, which we titled Yellow Rage. And we always dedicated it to the two old white women in Aspen, Colorado, who asked us why we cursed so much. So yeah, some people accused our anger of being for shock value, not for substance, not being authentic. And a lot of times it really felt like we weren't being taken seriously, which I saw as those people being sexist and racist towards us. But even so, I was worried about Sepna being uncomfortable with the anger in our poetry, and I could see her point about being boxed in as angry Asian American women. So we did try something different for the last poem we were expected to perform in Aspen. For the third piece, we decided to write something more celebratory, a poem about being proud to be Asian American that wasn't spoken from a place of confrontation but of celebration. It wasn't fully finished by the time we went to Aspen, but we were still committed to it, and we thought we had enough time to work on it before the first actual show. So when we were doing rehearsals in Aspen, the deaf poetry producers loved the first two pieces, of course. But during the third, we saw them whispering to each other in the audience. And I remember Sepna coming up to me and Katsy afterwards saying, they're not going to let us do it. And she was right. They cut it, saying the energy level dropped too much. And I remember Sepna looking at me as we were walking off stage and shaking her head saying, I knew it. I knew they weren't going to let us do it. And the producers saw and heard us saying this to each other after they cut it. So they told us that we could recite a few lines from the celebratory poem as we were walking on stage for the curtain call at the end of the show. But we were the only poets who didn't perform 3 poems during the Aspen show. We only performed 2, Woman Flavor and Listen Asshole. I think that moment hit all of us and really was eye-opening because we were suddenly very aware of how easily we could be boxed in as angry Asian women and nothing else. But at the time, as I said, I was deeply committed to anger as a tool. And I still am in many ways because my anger was and is real. It's rooted in lived experience and a fierce love for our people and our communities. So I don't regret those poems at all. But now looking back, I can also see what Sepna was calling out, how anger can sometimes close doors if there's no space left for conversation. But none of this is to say I regret anything. I will always stand behind the poems Katsy and I have performed over the years and the performances we've done all over the country. I will be grateful to Deaf Poetry always for giving us an opportunity and a platform. And Danny Simmons supported us many times after we were no longer directly affiliated with Deaf Poetry. He even came to Community College of Philadelphia to support Drop the Mic, the slam poetry TV show I created with Alan Kobernick for CCP students and alumni. But honestly, when Deaf Poetry first heard Sepna had left the group and we were a duo and not a trio anymore, they almost decided not to have Katsy and me on the HBO series. But then one of the producers, Deb Pointer, convinced them to give Katsy and me a chance. And so they did invite us to perform for the HBO series. Again, I'll always be grateful for that. And I'm proud of what Katsy and I have accomplished. Over the years, many Asian American people have told us that Yellow Rage gave voice to their own anger. That when they saw Katsy and me perform Listen Asshole on the first season of Deaf Poetry Jam on HBO, they felt relief. Like, finally, someone said what I've always wanted to say. Some people have told us that they cried watching that performance because it meant so much to see Asian American women on screen being angry out loud and unapologetically. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of our role in challenging stereotypes about Asian and Asian American women. And I'm proud that we stood on the front lines and absorbed backlash, even from within our own communities. So no, I don't regret the anger. I never will. Like I said, those poems came from love, fierce, protective love for my people, for our communities, for our right to be seen as whole people. That anger gave me a language when silence felt like another kind of violence. But what I'm reckoning with now in 2026 is the aftermath. Back then, I didn't want dialogue. I didn't want questions. I didn't want to explain myself to people who had never had to explain their existence. Back then, I believed wholeheartedly that if someone felt uncomfortable hearing our poetry, that was their problem to sit with, not mine to solve or fix. And maybe that was true then. But now I wonder about the doors I closed in the process. I wonder how often my anger, as necessary as it seemed to me at the time, how often it became a wall instead of a bridge. How often it may have been protecting me, but keeping other people at a distance who might have been ready to listen. And that's what I appreciate about Sepna. What I've learned from her even still in looking back 25 years later. And I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I wonder how things would have been different if she were still part of Yellow Rage. I even have visions of us one day reuniting and performing Woman Flavor the way we originally did, all choreographed like an R&B group where we would switch places as we were saying the hook so that the person whose verse it was in that moment was in the center. I just think it would be so much fun to perform it that way at least one more time before we call it quits. Oh my gosh, I didn't think I was going to get so emotional talking about this. And I know that I didn't tell Sepna enough that I appreciated how she wanted dialogue. How she wanted people to know she was thoughtful and open and willing to engage beyond the stage. Because Sepna understood something back then that I didn't yet have words for. She knew that anger without space for conversation can narrow down into a single story. And she didn't want to be reduced to an emotion or to a stereotype or to a moment on a stage. So when she decided to step away and focus on medical school, it was her being honest about who she was and what she needed. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Sepna in this episode is because what I'm worried about now, after 25 years of Yellow Rage, is how much as a society we talk over each other. How quickly we shout instead of listen. Anger can open something up, but it can also harden into a wall. And for me, I'm still figuring out how to hold both truths at once, that my anger is intentional and necessary, and that connection requires openness. I've also learned that intentional anger doesn't disappear, it evolves. So yeah, I'm still angry, but I'm also listening. Maybe listening more than I ever have in my life. And maybe the real work now isn't choosing between anger and dialogue, but figuring out how to let them sit in the same room without erasing the other. Because disagreeing doesn't have to end the conversation. Sometimes, if we're mindful and intentional, it can be where the conversation finally begins. And this seems like a good place to end this episode. As I said, I'll be expanding on what I've learned about anger after 25 years of being part of Yellow Rage into the next Mind Your Margins episode. Myung and I are going to do our best this year to get these episodes out once a month. Also, I'm not including a closing segment where I pull an oracle card for a personal development message. That was something I wanted to try out last year because it's what I actually do to help me focus and reflect on ways that I can grow as a person and just be more mindful about my own energy, and in how I go about my life. And I was hoping it would do the same for all of you. But instead, this year, I may reserve some time at the end of the episodes to talk about books or movies or shows that I find particularly interesting. But today, I'd like to share some exciting news. My debut middle grade novel titled Talk Me a Story About Moon Rabbit will be published this fall 2026 by Atmosphere Press. I'm super grateful and so happy and honestly a little amazed that this story is finally making its way into the world. Talk Me a Story About Moon Rabbit is about a young girl named Shelley who finds her voice through the power of storytelling. It's a story about connection, imagination, and all of the magical ways stories help us make sense of who we are and where we come from. And I also drew all of the illustrations for it, which I'm really excited to talk more about. I wrote this book to honor my mom, who was the first storyteller in my life. She's the one who showed me that stories can comfort us, guide us, and sometimes even help us find the words we didn't know we had. So I'll be sharing more details in the coming months, including the final cover design, behind the scenes stuff about the process of drawing the illustrations, dates for the book launch party, and other ways to support the book if you're interested. Writing this story has been a long and meaningful journey. I've been working on this book since right after my mom passed away. It's been 8 years now since she passed away, since 2018. And so it really means a lot to finally be able to share it with everyone. But thank you so much for listening. Myung and I are very grateful to you for spending this time with us and sharing space. We hope you'll tune in for our next episode. And if you know anyone who you think would be interested in listening to our podcast, Myung and I hope that you will share it with them. If you'd like to contact Myung and me, you can reach out to us via email at mindyourmargins@gmail.com and on Facebook and Instagram. Myung and I also hope you will subscribe to Mind Your Margins so you'll be notified when a new episode is posted. And depending on when you listen to this episode, I wish you a happy Lunar New Year. Again, I appreciate you so much for listening, for reflecting alongside me, and for being part of this space where we're all trying to live a little more thoughtfully and intentionally. Until we share space again, please be mindful of yourselves and mindful of others. Take good care.
I am who I am because it's been like grandfather. One in a billion ancestors. I need to define my space, define my face in this ancestral embrace that is skin tight, but my skin fits me just right. They're all there, my ancestral throne, for I am, we are, lifetimes infinite, billion strong.